host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. We are also a YouTube channel now. If you go to YouTube to Spirit Matters Talk, all three words, you'll find it. Before we started, to help keep us on the air, help keep our archives with 260 plus episodes now, free and available to the public. And we want to continue doing that. And if anyone wants to contribute, we're not a nonprofit, it's not a donation. You can go to spiritmatterstalk.com. We are thrilled today to have on as a guest a leading figure in the Buddhist community in the United States, Sharon Salzberg. She is a central figure in the field of meditation and world-renowned teacher and author. She is the co-founder of Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and the author of 11 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness. And the book her latest book, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. Sharon, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on and speak with us today. And there's the book. So
well, thank you.
Phil.
Sharon, great to have you with us. We always like to have our listeners be familiar with the spiritual path and the history of our guests. So if you could briefly tell us how you went from in your early days as a seeker to become one of the people who has brought that form of Buddhism into American life, it would be of interest to people.
Sure. Well, I grew up in New York City. I went to college in Buffalo, New York when I was 16 years old.
SUNY Buffalo.
SUNY Buffalo, that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a sophomore, I took an Asian philosophy course. There had been a philosophy requirement. I had to do something. And in all honesty, as I look back at that decision, I think I just looked at the calendar and thought, well, that's on Tuesday. That's convenient. Let me do that one. So I did this Asian philosophy course, which completely changed my life. And there were two aspects that were most predominant. One was in talking about the Buddha, when the instructor would talk about the Buddha's take on suffering, that suffering is an inevitable and natural part of life. And unlike our assumption that that's a grim thing to hear, it actually was tremendously reassuring to me. Like many people, I'd had a childhood that had some amount of trauma and real difficulty. And like for many people, mine was a family system where this was never ever spoken about. So I didn't know what to do with all of those feelings inside of me. And here the Buddha saying suffering is a natural part of life, translated in my mind to, you're not so weird. You belong. This is inevitable. This is just a part of things. And so that was very important. And then I heard in the context of that class that there were methods, there were tools, there were actual techniques people used. They were called meditation. And if you did them, you would be a whole lot happier. So I looked around Buffalo, New York. This is 1970. I did not see it anywhere. And I created an independent study project and presented it to the university. I said, I want to go to India and study meditation. And they said, okay.
Wow.
So off I went. And I actually began meditating January 7th, 1971.
In India,
Wow.
Bodh Gaya or someplace? Yeah.
In Bodh Gaya, yeah.
Wonderful.
Now, let me ask, I got involved in TM in 1970. So we were in, and it was all new to me, spirituality, and I got introduced to it not unlike you did. And it was, I had to go looking for it kind of as you did. At the time when you went, were you seeking, was it more, I want to be a Buddhist now and I want to learn more about the Buddha and go down that road? Or I'm looking for these tools that allow me to go inward, meditation, or was it both or a combination of things? And how did that evolve as you took your journey?
I don't think it was really at all about becoming a Buddhist, or I was really interested in the practical, direct how to, like, what do you do? You know, and how do you do
Mhm.
it? And that flavor actually continued throughout much of my early acquaintance with the Buddhist teaching, because after all, here's the Buddha himself saying, don't believe anything. You know, don't believe anything just because I said it, because a great elder has said it, because you've read it in the sacred text. He said, put it into practice. See for yourself what's true. And I considered that like a breathtaking vision of human potential. It wasn't like, follow me, believe me. It was like, you can figure it out. You know, you can see for yourself what's true. Here are some tools. And in fact, my first teacher was S.N. Goenka. It was a 10-day intensive immersive retreat in Bodh Gaya, India. And the first night of my first retreats, this is really like foundational stuff for me. Goenka said, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught a way of life. And this is completely open. It's completely available to anybody. It's not a question of becoming a Buddhist. And so this is like day one,
Mhm.
right? Or night one. And so
Right.
it really became a pillar of my own approach.
And not long after that, you and Joseph Goldstein, if I'm remembering right, Jack Kornfield, the original Jubus, had you introduced that form of mindfulness meditation. Prior to that, most people's understanding of Buddhism was Zen, because Zen had been popularized by the beats and so forth. Maybe you would like to explain why, how those two traditions differ, and what the essential form of meditation was that you brought to Barre and the West.
Mm-hmm. Well, I met Joseph Goldstein at my first retreat in January of 1971. And also there were like Ram Dass was a student there at that retreat, and Krishna Das, and many people who are still my good friends. And Jack Kornfield at the same time was having like a parallel life in Thailand, times in Bangkok. And we met up in 1974. You know, so I went in 70, I began meditating in 71. I did come back to do what I needed to do to get 2 years of independent study credit from school. Then I went back to India. So I came back in 1974. Joseph had already come back maybe 6 months before, and Jack had left Thailand. And we all met up in Boulder, Colorado, where the Europa Institute was first beginning. And we began getting, they were teaching, and I became sort of like Joseph's TA, his teaching assistant. And then we started getting invitations to lead retreats. So it would be very kind of haphazard. We had nothing. We were sleeping on people's living room couches, and we'd get some letter, because of course it was all letters then, and we'd respond to an invitation, some combination of this small group of us. And at some point, somebody said to us, why don't you start a real retreat center in this country? It would be a kind of sacred site in this country. It would be a place where kind of energy that gets generated as people come together, it doesn't have to dissipate. And the forms we were teaching were pretty direct. You know, the actual form of a retreat came largely from Goenka. The methodology came largely from the Mahasi Sayadaw school in Burma, which is trying to bring a continuity of awareness to sitting, standing, walking, lying down, eating. Everything that you're doing becomes kind of a meditation. So I haven't done much Zen practice, and I've taught, say, with friends like Roshi Joan Halifax, who sometimes says things to me like, that's a lot of explanation, you know, because Zen in my mind is like poetry. You immerse yourself in that environment and things happen. Whereas the Burmese are very exacting, like, see if you can feel the breath as it moves in and out. These may be the sensations that you feel. Apply a mental note to, you know, it's very technique oriented. And essentially, of course, one has to think all these things are the same, and that they're offering us the path out of some very real and direct suffering that we are likely experiencing. And so I think we live in an amazing time in that you can kind of look around and see what feels right to you.
Sharon, before you ask my next question, I forgot to mention in the introduction that you have a podcast, and one that I was listening to before we came on, and I was really enjoying it, the Metta Hour. So METTA, and this will all be posted up. I highly recommend our listeners go there. She's got a tremendous number of interviews, and I'll certainly be listening to it more. So in the years since 71 to now, I'm just curious, your practice, has it changed much, or did you learn one basic practice or a set of practices and have kept them the same for the last 50 years?
50 years, isn't that shocking? So shocking.
When I hear that, I think the same thing.
A lot of 50th anniversaries these days.
It's funny because in this time of, I'm in Barre, I'm quite isolated. I find myself going back to like meditation 101. So I'm doing a lot of what was the first technique I ever learned, which was sit and just feel your breath, feel the natural movement of the in and out breath. And I've done several different practices over the years. That is still a foundational practice I come back to. At the end of my first retreat, so in 1971, Goenka led a metta, METTA, loving kindness meditation. But it was very much, it's almost like a ceremonial way of saying goodbye, to offer loving kindness to yourself, to others, to the entire world. And it intrigued me, and I thought, oh, what's that one? And it wasn't until 1985 that I had the chance to go to Burma for 3 months and do an intensive meditation retreat using just that technique of loving kindness. And that became very much what I was teaching, really all over the world, what I was writing about. So that was a big addition, you could say. And I've had Tibetan teachers since those early days. All my early teachers were either Burmese or themselves had practiced in Burma. And then I began working with different Tibetan teachers, and and those were some other techniques. I'd say the main parts of my practice, let's say pre-pandemic, were an awareness practice, a mindfulness or an open awareness practice when I was formally sitting. And then I tried to do loving kindness, I would say, whenever I was waiting, and I counted every mode of transportation as waiting. So every airplane, every taxi, walking down the streets of New York, waiting in someone's waiting room, I would silently be repeating phrases like, may you be happy, may you be peaceful. And then in coming here and not traveling, and in that kind of life switch, I've incorporated a lot more formal loving kindness in my sitting. So I am doing a lot of that as well.
So here's this is a good segue to something I wanted to ask you about, because you're alluding to a variety of practices just within a single tradition. And then if you add all the yoga-based and Hindu-based meditation practices, a tremendous variety, and there's a tendency to lump them all together. And these days, mindfulness has become a kind of catchphrase that people just throw out for anything, any practice that uses the mind. Are you concerned about that kind of confusion around, or the tendency to conflate everything under a certain umbrella and not have the distinctive qualities of each brought out?
I don't know that I'm so concerned about that, because it's like a tidal wave. It's like, what do? The things I think about that I try to maintain my own sense of integrity around, which is all I really can do, are a few. One is that, and this isn't like putting it down really, but I'd say that the main kind of popularization point of mindfulness, as is understood, is basically inhabiting our lives much more fully. It's like if I'm drinking this cup of tea, to really feel the weight of the cup, the warmth of the cup, to smell the tea, to taste the tea, and thereby have a much more fulfilling cup of tea, which is great. I think we would be different, our world would be different if we weren't always chasing after something that wasn't here. So that's really how it's described as fully living or fully inhabiting your lives. I'd say classically, in my understanding, while that might be appreciated, the main benefit of mindfulness is not inhabiting our lives, it's understanding our lives. You know, we get to look at these thoughts, these patterns, these forces, these emotions for ourselves in a way that isn't like buying into them and also isn't pushing them away. So we get to understand, you know, maybe my whole life I've been taught that strength, real strength is vengefulness. It's like hold a grudge forever. But you get to look at that mind state and what it does in your body. And you think, maybe not so strong, actually. Or so many of us have been taught that compassion, generosity, kindness are really kind of stupid, and they're sentimental, they're saccharine sweet, they will bring you down. But you get to look at those too. And a whole other understanding of their strength can emerge. And then, you know, just because we're paying attention through mindfulness, we see qualities of change and the truth of change in a whole other level. And we see things like interconnection that really, however alone we might feel, that the truth, the reality is that our lives are all connected. And it's because we understand our lives in a whole other way, what brings happiness, what brings suffering, that mindfulness helps us live differently. So I'm
Sharon,
concerned about that. You don't hear a lot about wisdom or insight, you know.
I wanted to mention your book. I want to get into this a bit. And I started reading it yesterday, Real Change. And I was taken by the subtitle, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. And many people that listen to our podcast are seasoned practitioners of spiritual practice that have been on a path a long time. A lot of people are brand new. They just dial in, and often you'll hear people say, when they think of meditation, when they think of Buddhism, when they think of Buddhist practice, they might think this is something you do for yourself. Your subtitle connects the self to the world. And if you could reflect on that in terms of practice, Buddhist practice, and how the individual practicing it, how that translates to healing or changing the world.
Well, I think it's inevitable, even if it's somewhat unspoken, you know, or even unseen, because we change, you know, we do develop understanding, we do develop insight into what brings us happiness, and it's not being selfish, turns out, you know, and we do develop insight about strength, and turns out that vengefulness is not the best path to strength. We also learn things about balance, you know, ways we might say have a friend who's struggling and we want out of the deepest compassion to help, and how that needs to be accompanied maybe by compassion for ourselves as well, or wisdom, you know, a sense of boundaries, a sense of reality. Like, I sadly can't control your mind, you know, like no one has as of yet invented the chip we can implant in someone else's brain with our having the remote control, like cheer up, you know. And would it be a better world? Probably, you know, at least if I had the control, I believe it would be, but that's not reality. And so there are ways in which we just change through the process of meditation. And these are all because our lives are connected, our lives are about relationship. of one kind or another, then our actions just shift. And, you know, there's studies now about how mindfulness will bring about compassion, and it's a very lived compassion. What I was also trying to do in the book, I think it was two different populations I had especially in mind. One were people that we call caregivers, you know, people who either in their professional lives or in their personal lives, in their family, or just the way they tend to relate to others, are the givers. They're the caregivers. They're, you know, they're offering help. They're on the front lines of suffering often. And I've been teaching a lot of people like that. And they're incredibly kind and giving, and they're burning out in droves. And so maybe it's that question of balance, maybe it's that question of limits, whatever. And so in my work in teaching, I've been offering tools of meditation to a lot of people who are on the front lines of suffering. And one day I just kind of thought, oh, activists are kind of like that too. You know, they're in that same predicament. Maybe contemplative tools would be applicable. So that was one whole population. The other population was really going back to meditation, bringing forth compassion. I've probably had countless people say to me, you know, I was walking down the street and somebody came up to me and asked me for $1, and I gave them $1 because that's my habit. But it's the first time I've ever looked that street person in the eye and realized that's a human being. You know, and that I see really as the fruition of their meditation. But people often follow that with a sense of helplessness. Well, I could never do enough. I can't contribute enough. I don't have the smarts. I don't have the wherewithal to make a real difference. And so I won't do anything. And so I really wanted to encourage people to take that step, even if it seems very small, or reach out to someone, or just try to do the good that's in front of you, even if it seems like it could never be enough, because that's how I believe change happens. And so I always get happy when people show me the book cover, because as someone pointed out to me, it's the same color as the Statue of Liberty, which was a total accident. It was a complete accident. She's like my icon. She's my heroine. She's in this book. She's in other books I've written. And she'd always been a symbol of tremendous compassion to me. Of course, there's the poem, there's her greeting. It's a sense of you belong. You can find a home here. Even you, that no one else wants. You have a place here. But it was only actually in researching this book that I kind of comprehended more fully that she's actually in mid-stride. I mean, that's how she is. Her one leg is up because she's taking a step. It's a very active compassion. It's not just kind of laying back, you know, with the welcome. It's taking the step, and that's become an important symbol for me.
Great. I was pleased when I received the book that you had moved in that direction. Well, maybe it wasn't a move, but that you were addressing the larger issues beyond self-improvement and gaining enlightenment or whatever. That's been the preoccupation of so many of us of a certain generation spiritually. And over the years, I'm not the only one who came to the conclusion that there's a little too much self-involvement and not enough engagement, not enough social concern, especially the last 5 years. So I've been talking and writing about it, and I was very pleased to see you were too. Did you share that observation that in the larger population of meditators and yogis, there was a tendency to withdraw rather than engage? And are you trying to provide a sort of counterbalance to that?
Well, I mean, I think there have been strong counterbalances to that, totally without me, you know, like,
yeah.
You know, so I don't think like I'm seeding a movement or anything, you know. I think part of what's happened is that as the conversation shifts, like I'll go back to that person on the street who looked the guy in the eye and saw for the first time that this was a human being. There's another step that people often don't follow. Not only do they not necessarily take action, I mean, they give the guy $1, but that it might stop there. But there's also not a common looking toward systems change. You know, it's like if you give the guy $1, do you then go on to think, well, what's the housing policy in this city, so that there's so many people on the streets? Not likely, unless you're trained to that, you know, and that's its own kind of education. Does it exist within Buddhism? I actually believe it does, you know, as a kind of analysis of conditionality and causes and conditions and so on. But it wouldn't be a common tool. And so I think there is a next step for a lot of people that's not just an emotional reaction to you know, some very, very painful things we might witness or undergo, but it actually has that kind of systems view in place, which would be a big change.
Sharon, I have one final question from my side, and I'll turn it over to Phil. Your book, who should read it? What should they expect to get from it? What would you like them to get out of the book?
This last book?
Yes.
I would like to have people always, whether they're sitting in front of me or on Zoom or reading a book, emerge with a greater sense of confidence and clarity about using these tools if they find that interesting or appealing, in some context of understanding that we do live in an interconnected universe, that we rely on one another, that we are dependent on one another, and that it's through that understanding we find the strength in qualities like kindness that we might have really thought were weaknesses actually before.
I should point out to listeners and viewers now that there's a lot of practical tools in the book. One caught my eye was every chapter has a form of meditation practice or mindfulness practice. And there was one that helps people deal with difficult thoughts and feelings that arise. And these last few years, especially, and with the pandemic, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of anger, fear, loneliness, grief. I know it's complicated, but perhaps you'd share some advice for people dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the cup in this room with me, but friends are taking to making me cups with things I often say on them. You know, so this one says banging your head against the wall is never fun, which apparently is something I say a lot. But another cup someone sent me says, we feel what we feel. You know, so rather than chastising ourselves or blaming ourselves, or like I potentially have a brand new thing to say to myself, which is, you've been meditating for 50 years. Why are you still feeling that? You know, we can get kind of into that routine but we feel what we feel. And one of the actual benefits of mindfulness is that it helps us be with our feelings, both beautiful, pleasant, wonderful ones, and really difficult, painful feelings in a different way. So, you know, our relationship to these feelings can often be quite distorted. And that comes in the form of what we call add-ons. You know, let's say you're feeling sadness, you're feeling fear. What might you be adding on to it that conceivably is making it even worse? Sense of future anticipation. What's it going to feel like tomorrow? What's it going to feel like next week? Sense of solidity. This is the only thing I ever feel. Sense of isolation. I am the only one that feels this. Sense of having lost control. I should have been able to stop this. So the blame and the anguish and everything we pile on makes it so much worse. And actually, we do have the capacity. We have the awareness, we have the balance, we have the clarity to be with these feelings in a different way. So that different way doesn't mean shunning them or pushing them away, but it also doesn't mean being overcome by them and defined by them. And so we say sometimes mindfulness is the place in the middle where you're fully aware of what you're experiencing without falling into it, without pushing it away. And that's where the learning takes place. So that's the first thing we say is like, look for the add-ons. What might I be adding on to this experience? And see if you can relinquish the add-ons. And then we have a chance to look at the feeling. So let's say it's anger, this great wave of anger. Instead of like what I'm angry about and what I'm going to do about it, we get interested in the anger itself. Like, what does it feel like? So it's almost like that pivot, the gesture of my hand. And what does it feel like in my body? What's the mood? What's like the anger moving? And if we can sit there without the add-ons, we'll see, oh, look at all those moments of sadness that are part of that. Look at all those moments of fear that are a part of that. And I have had the uniform experience, and it's actually somewhat in the teachings, that if we sit with the anger with that kind of clarity, we will see a kind of kernel of helplessness. And it's to make that feeling go away that we reach for that other energy. And I know that if I can get to that level where I see the helplessness, I can then resolve to do something, even if it seems very small. And that's like channeling the energy of the anger without getting kind of consumed by it.
I have one other question, has to do with practice. Most people associate Buddhism or Buddha and the secular methods that grew out of it, as a kind of austere path of meditation practice, especially Zen. Is there a devotional element in your practice? And the reason I thought of this is I'm on Krishna Das's mailing list, and I see you're doing a program with him, our leading bhakta. And so I'm curious about your and other people committed to a Buddhist practice, whether there's a devotional outlet.
Well, Krishnadas was at my first retreat, so we've been friends for 50 years, which is like shocking. And we do teach together, fairly frequently whenever we can. He usually provides the bhakti. I mean, and actually, I listen to his chanting all the time, and it is a vehicle for me. So there is a kind of bhakti strain within Buddhist teaching, certainly toward the Buddha himself. There's chanting, there are devotional practices in the monastic traditions, especially. And it's just generally love, I mean, it's there. It's not really a cold, even when we use the word mindfulness, it implies, say, being relieved of all that self-judgment, and really being kind to ourselves and being able to open to those painful feelings without blaming ourselves. But some people don't like the word mindfulness because they say it sounds cold, like it's very heady and very clinical. So I see a struggle going on trying, people say, why don't we call it kindfulness, or call it warm mindfulness, or call it heartfulness, or Ram Dass's loving awareness. And so we'll just call it mindfulness, but let's understand what mindfulness actually means. And so there's certainly love, and there's loving kindness, and there's often devotion to one's teacher or to the Buddha himself. And for many people, that, for some people that is like the biggest drawing card ever, and for some people it's not what they're interested in. They're interested in the science and the neuroscience and or some people have both, actually.
Right. Good. Thank you for being with us. Audience, her new book is Real Change. Some of her previous books were also real something, real happiness, real love. So she obviously likes to keep it real. And we thank you for being with us, and keep up the good work. And revisit.
Right. And the podcast.
Yes. Go ahead.
Her podcast, Sharon's podcast, the Meta Hour. The Meta Hour, easy to find online, and click and listen. Enjoy it.
Probably
And enjoy
some of
us.
the same
Spirit
guests
Matters
we've
at
had.
spiritmatters.com.
We've probably shared many again.
Probably, yeah. Actually, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. Take care.
Phil, that was Sharon Salzberg. She entered the spiritual kind of journey around that. Well, you started earlier than me, but I started TM in 70, not far from where she was. I was in New York City. And so I did not at that time ever hear of mindfulness or much about, I did like her. I took a course in college on Eastern philosophy, and it
You
was
were
discussion
lucky.
of the Buddha. Huh?
You and she were lucky.
Yeah, Buddhism, that sort of thing. But then most of the exposure I had came from more Hindu tradition. And so I heard less about, I didn't really know anybody doing Buddhist practice back then. Did you? How common
Well,
was it
back
back then?
before-
Mindfulness, you hear, I never heard mindfulness
No, that
maybe
came,
the last 10 years, yeah.
that came up a little. No, well, they were using more the Buddhist term vipassana a lot. And I remember learning about those methods, and that there were Americans teaching it maybe in the mid to late 70s when she and the others started the retreat center at Barre. But in the late 60s, when I got into all this, Zen was the popular form of Buddhism. And the first exposure I had to Eastern philosophy were books on Zen, like Alan Watts and others. And then, of course, all the gurus that came, Maharishi and Muktananda and Satchidananda and all those people that I wrote about were that became the orientation for most of us as
Right, but the
Zen.
ashram she went to, the guru was Hindu, was he not, or from Hindu tradition? And
no, she
was it Buddhist?
went specifically to Bodh Gaya, which is
Okay.
the part in the north of India. It's the place where Buddha was said to have become enlightened, and the Bodhi tree that he sat under when he attained his awakening is there as a pilgrimage kind of thing. And there are teachers and retreat centers and all that. It sounds like she went there for that. She had, maybe it was chance, but maybe she had that destination in mind to learn Buddhist practices.
Right. Also, I wanted to ask about what you know more, the Insight Meditation Society, which Sharon was a co-founder of. That's very, very well known. I've heard a lot about it. It's out in I think she said it's between Amherst and Worcester, Massachusetts, out in that area. Have you been there? And
No.
Who else is out of that? Is Cornfield from there?
I think they all started it together. I don't know if Jack Kornfeld, I don't know the whole story, but the three names I always have associated with that place was Jack Kornfeld, Susan Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein. There may have been others, but those are well-known people who became well-known. Jack Kornfeld at some point moved to Marin County and started Spirit Rock, meditation and retreat center there, which is probably very similar to what's done in Barre. But I don't know enough of the details, but people can Google.
Now, when did the term mindfulness become so very popular? Because, like I said, it's really in the last decade that I've heard it from every angle.
Yeah.
And maybe I heard it before. Maybe I was associated with Buddhism before, but I don't remember it. It wasn't certainly wasn't as bantered around as it is now.
No, I think it became a kind of the English word for a certain category of Buddhist practices. And it caught on, and I think the principal catalyst for that was John Kabat-Zinn, other, very important mindfulness practitioner who did studies, I believe at Mass General, studying the efficacy of these practices on various measures of health and well-being, similar to what happened to TM back in the early 70s, studying these forms, and the secularization of them became mindfulness, stress management, and things like that. And it caught on. And so the English term mindfulness became widely used. And as we
does the Dalai Lama use the term mindfulness when he talks about practice?
He probably does. I know Thich Nhat Hanh
so.
did. Thich Nhat Hanh certainly did. So, it, strictly speaking, it was applied to a certain category of kind of Buddhist practice. But, the way things happen in popular media, when something gets a lot of attention, people are careless with their phrases. So now mindfulness is applied to anything, any meditation form people call mindfulness, even if it's not, what we would think of as a meditative practice. And it gets a little confusing, but, people who are serious will sort it out. Yeah. But I was.
Yeah, no, Buddhism.
What?
Say that again.
You froze. What did you say?
You broke up there for a second.
Oh, I thought you broke up.
Buddhism.
Who broke up with who?
Okay. I don't know. It's breaking up is hard to do. There was a song, but Buddhism. No, it's hard to tell how many Buddhists there are in the United States, because when somebody becomes a Buddhist, they don't necessarily, it's not like becoming baptized or bar mitzvah or something. It's, it's just you make that decision. Phil Jackson, for the coach of the Chicago Bulls, he became a Buddhist. But what did that mean? Did he just decide? I think it's more of a decision or a way of life or a practice you participate in, or a decision you make that I'm a Buddhist.
Will self-identify as Buddhist. Obviously, there's a whole lot of people in America who were born into it. What the scholars call the inheritors, as opposed to the adopters. So also within Hinduism, there's a lot of people born into Hinduism, and they're self-identified Hindus. They're the inheritors. But then there's people like us who practice all the forms that derive from what we call Hinduism, but very few of us self-identify as Hindus. But it's a kind of similar thing in Buddhist world. There's a tremendous number of people employing Buddhist practices and principles who don't call themselves Buddhists, but many do. So it's probably an individual choice. And
it's a wonderful and complicated world of spirituality.
I love that.
And by the way, this is being recorded on March 18th, the day after St. Patrick's Day, 2021. We're hoping that the pandemic is fading. It seems that way, but we're not 100% sure. But certainly, I think during this period of time, this last year, which has been very trying for so many people, and it's been, difficult time. But I think many people discovered the value of going inward, of being more on the self and more absorbed in the outer world. And that gives one strength and an ability to move more easily through these, rough waters of pandemic and other turbulence that comes in the world. So
I'm very
good to have
pleased that,
an internal and an external life.
and I'm very pleased to give her another plug, Real Change. I'm very pleased that one of our
Right.
leading voices for the turning inward and in using practices, meditative practices, has
Right.
also addressed the importance of healing the world, because
Right.
it's not only important to protect ourselves and heal ourselves, like I did in my recent book. The last chapter was about bringing, the qualities of inner peace and expanded clarity of mind
And
into
Phil,
the
and
world.
for those
Taking it-
listening and
Hmm?
watching, you have a copy of your book to show them, the cover,
Oh, that would,
your latest book?
that would be self-serving, Dennis. Why would I
That's what
do
we do.
that?
Because you're not only serving yourself, but it's serving yourself,
Serving the
you're serving the
world.
world. But yeah, give us the title, because I don't know if it's printable.
So I was really glad we were able to get.
All right,
Sharon.
well,
We should have her back.
yeah, and before we end, again, I want to thank those people that have contributed, allowed us to stay in the air, upgrade our equipment a bit, and for those who would like to keep us on the air and like to keep our archives free and available to all, and at least 260 plus episodes in there now, go to spiritmatterstalk.com, and it's very easy to contribute. Also, Jack Grieshaber, who has helped us with all our technology, asked me to mention, which I forgot during the interview, but now during the discussion section, in the lower right-hand corner when you're watching, there's a spot to click or listening, whether your podcast is a little spot that says subscribe. It's a little red subscribe right where my finger is if you're watching. And that's where you click. And please subscribe. It means a lot to us if you do.
You could, in other
appreciate it.
words, listeners, you can subscribe to the audio podcast, or you can subscribe, or you could subscribe to the YouTube channel, should you care to see us. Thank you, Dennis. See you next time.